Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most unwanted job descriptions in medieval Europe, the executioner. And that's saying something in a time when rat catcher and full-time plague survivor were legitimate career paths. From swinging the sword of justice to being cursed, feared, and socially exiled, the life of a medieval executioner was a strange, brutal paradox. He was necessary, but never welcome. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you've just been born. Congratulations. You're the newest addition to a proud medieval family of executioners. That's right. While other babies are wrapped in linen and destined to become bakers, butchers, or, if they're lucky, monks, you are gently placed in a cradle next to a whetstone and an axe. It's not a rattle you're shaking, it's a future. In the Middle Ages, execution wasn't a job you applied for. There was no town hall resume submission. It was inherited like a really cursed family heirloom. If your father was the executioner, you were the next in line. Simple. No room for career changes. No hopes of becoming a traveling bard or a slightly sad shoemaker. Your path was laid out, and it ended at the chopping block. From the moment you're old enough to walk, you're already getting side-eyed by villagers. Other kids run from you at the well. Adults lower their voices when you walk by, as if your tiny toddler hands are already soaked in symbolic blood. Spoiler, they are, symbolically, of course, for now. You grow up in a house where the family dinner table conversations are less, "How was your day?" and more, "How many strikes should it take to get it clean?" There's no escaping it. Your toys might include miniature gallows, and your bedtime stories involve phrases like drawing and quartering instead of happily ever after. And it's not just the job, it's the reputation. You could be the kindest, most literate, soft-spoken child in the kingdom, and people would still treat you like you sneak into homes at night whispering threats to chickens. Your very surname might mark you. In some towns, entire family lines of executioners were labeled, tracked, and sometimes forbidden from entering churches, bakeries, or public baths. Hygiene and salvation, not for you. But hey, there are perks. You'll probably never get bullied too hard. No one wants to mess with the executioner's kid. The fear is real. You might not be liked, but you will be respected in the same way people respect thunder or very sharp knives. So, welcome to life. You didn't ask for this, but it's yours now forever. A bouncing baby bundle of joy, swaddled in wool, baptized in holy water, and immediately cursed with generational trauma. You're the newest member of a family of executioners, medieval society's most necessary yet least invited profession. While other children are destined to churn butter or one day inherit a sheep farm, you've been born into the one job that guarantees everyone will avoid you like a coughing stranger during a plague year. Your future is set. Sharp metal, public crowds, and a lifetime of being the guy no one makes eye contact with, even when you're 6. And no, you don't get to choose. Executioner isn't something you apply to be. There's no medieval job fair with a booth that says, "Love justice, hate popularity, inquire within." If your dad swung the axe, guess what you're swinging after puberty? Even as a toddler, villagers whisper when you pass. You haven't even committed your first decapitation, and you're already treated like you bite livestock. The blacksmith's kid gets candy. You get suspicious glances and extra space in the pews. That is if you're even allowed in church. Family dinners are less "how was your day?" and more "did you remember to oil the gallows chain?" Your bedtime stories don't feature dragons unless they're being hanged for heresy. Your toys include miniature scaffolds. Your version of hide-and-seek usually ends in people hiding and never coming back. You can't even marry out of it. Most respectable families won't let their daughters within 5 feet of you, let alone the altar, which is probably fine since your family name has been whispered like a curse word for the past 3 generations. That's Carl's boy. You know, the one whose grandfather swung too deep last winter. And sure, there are perks. No one bullies the executioner's kid. Even the local tough guy doesn't want to end up as practice. You develop a strong back, a steady hand, and a deadpan stare that gets you out of most social events, which is helpful because you're never invited anyway. So, there it is. You're not just born, you're branded. You didn't choose the axe life. The axe life chose you, and it's not letting go. By the time you're old enough to grow a beard or swing a training axe, you've already accepted one core truth. The town needs you, but they'd prefer you stay out of sight, preferably behind a curtain, a hill, or a moral veil of plausible deniability. As a medieval executioner, you are society's walking contradiction. You do the work no one else dares to do. And for that, you're rewarded with silence, suspicion, and the occasional terrified blessing from 10 feet away. People talk to you like you're a haunted well. Useful in a crisis, but deeply unsettling the rest of the time. Need someone publicly disemboweled? The town calls you. Need someone invited to their daughter's wedding feast? Not a chance. You're the final solution to every problem the sheriff doesn't want on his conscience. And yet, once the deed is done and the head rolls into the hay, everyone suddenly remembers they had somewhere else to be, usually anywhere that isn't next to you. In court records, you are referred to as the Blade of Justice. In tavern gossip, you're that creepy guy who probably talks to skulls. You could save a child from drowning, and someone would still whisper, "Yes, but how many people has he chopped in half?" To them, you are both punishment and paranoia. A reminder that the law has teeth. Big, sharp, public ones. And let's not pretend it's just the peasants. Even nobles turn their noses up. They'll pay you in silver and pat themselves on the back for upholding justice. But you'll never be invited to dine in their halls unless it's to demonstrate proper axe form between courses. Best of all, if something goes wrong, let's say you botch an execution or someone gets squeamish mid-torture, it's your head on the proverbial and possibly literal chopping block. The same crowd that cheered your last performance will turn on you faster than a spooked chicken. You're not a man, you're a tool, and everyone pretends you don't exist unless they need something violently removed. So, yes, the town needs you, but they'd rather you come in through the back door, wear a hood, and leave before sunrise. While other boys are learning how to plow fields, shoe horses, or, if they're especially blessed, read, your education is a bit more specialized. You're not studying scripture or sewing techniques. You're learning how to sever spines in one clean stroke. Welcome to your childhood apprenticeship, where precision isn't optional and failure doesn't just cost lives, it ruins your reputation before you even get one. Your father, or some grizzled older executioner with arms like tree trunks, teaches you the sacred art of not messing up in front of a crowd. because while everyone may pretend they hate what you do, they absolutely will judge your form, footwork, and follow-through like it's the medieval Olympics. Your curriculum includes chopping techniques because missing the neck by even an inch turns justice into a comedy show. Anatomy, because you need to know which bones are easiest to crack and which ones will make your axe bounce back in public humiliation. And stage presence, because, let's face it, every execution is a public performance. You're the final act, the main event, the reason people leave their farms and bring their kids to town square. Think of it as dinner theater, but instead of dessert, there's dismemberment. There's no practice dummy unless you count the occasional pig carcass or extremely unlucky rebel. Most of what you learn is on the job. And, let's be honest, everyone remembers your first time, especially if it doesn't go well. Especially if you freeze or shake, or, heaven forbid, take more than one swing. Nothing haunts you like a half-beheaded criminal and an impatient crowd. You're trained to be calm, efficient, unshakable, but no one teaches you how to cope. There's no medieval HR department, no stress leave, no how to not think about severed heads self-care scroll. You just sharpen your blade, swallow your guilt, and get ready for the next performance. And what do you get in return for your finely honed, lethal expertise? Not admiration, not gratitude, just silence. Maybe a few extra coins and the lingering stench of death on your clothes and soul. You're not just trained to kill. You're trained to carry the weight of it quietly. Picture this. It's a sunny morning. The market square is bustling. Bakers are selling bread that smells vaguely edible. Blacksmiths are banging away with impressive confidence. And the butcher is enthusiastically waving a cleaver. Everyone is shouting prices, gossiping, living their little medieval lives. Then you show up. The crowd parts like you're carrying the plague in one hand and a severed head in the other. And, to be fair, sometimes you are. But even when you're just there to buy turnips, people scatter like rats from a torch. You see, executioners were often forbidden or heavily discouraged from even entering public markets. In some towns, you had to wait until after hours to buy food. Very shallow. Often, the only people willing to marry executioners are other outcasts. Gravediggers, knackers, lepers, or, if you're lucky, widows whose standards have taken serious structural damage. Romantic, candle-lit dinners? Try conversations whispered in alleys so no one sees her talking to you. And if you do manage to marry and have children, they inherit your profession like a curse sewn into their skin. Sons are trained from youth to swing steel with surgical precision. And daughters, well, they carry the name, which is usually enough to be socially exiled by age 6. It's not so much a family as it is a legally necessary support staff. Your family can't attend festivals, can't walk through town together, can't pretend to be normal for even a single Sunday. If they do go to church, they sit in the back or they don't go at all. Because even salvation has bouncers, and over time that isolation takes a toll. You love your children, sure, but you also pass them a future that smells like blood and loneliness. The family tree doesn't grow. It repeats. Same job, same shame, same invisible wall between you and the rest of humanity. There are no proud portraits, no family crests, just a long line of people who wore hoods not to hide their faces, but because the world never wanted to see them in the first place. So, you've executed your duties literally all week. You've lopped off heads, disemboweled a heretic or two, and maybe even cleaned your blade with holy water out of sheer anxiety. Surely it's time to confess your sins, right? Light a candle, say a prayer, start fresh? Well, not quite. In the eyes of the medieval church, you're somewhere between necessary evil and walking contradiction. Yes, you enforce divine justice. Yes, you serve the state and uphold law and order, but also, and this is important, you kill people for a living, which inconveniently is a sin. And so, despite doing God's dirty work, you are not exactly welcome in his house. Many executioners were outright denied confession. Some priests wouldn't listen. Others insisted you undergo ritual cleansing before stepping inside the church, which is tricky because no amount of soap washes away a reputation. And don't even think about receiving Holy Communion. That was reserved for clean souls. Yours is more of a permanent stain. It's a cruel irony. You kill with state approval. Yet spiritually, you're treated like a man who strangles kittens for fun. Even lepers who at least had a medical excuse were often treated with more compassion. Weddings, not in the church. Christenings. Maybe if the priest is having a generous day and half the town isn't glaring at him. Funerals, don't count on it. Some executioners weren't even buried in consecrated ground. They got the ditch outside the cemetery walls. Prime real estate for exiles, suicides, and people who forgot to tithe. So, where does that leave you spiritually? Nowhere comforting. You spend your life surrounded by death, and yet you have no path to forgiveness. You can't unburden yourself. You can't cry to a friar or light a votive for your sins. Instead, you carry them quietly, heavily. Sometimes you drink. Sometimes you scream into the woods. Sometimes you just sharpen your blade again. Even when you believe you're doing right. When the law is clear, the trial fair, you still go home unsure whether you're damned by man, by God, or both. Because even in a world where everyone sins, you're the one who made a profession out of it. There's nothing quite like the pressure of performing executions in front of a screaming crowd. It's part justice, part ritual, part public entertainment, and you're the main act. Forget about nerves. Forget about bad weather. The crowd doesn't care if your wrist hurts, if your stomach's empty, or if the axe is a little dull from last week's double hanging. They came to see a show. And you? You're holding the spotlight and the blade. The goal is simple. One clean swing. A fast, clean beheading is the gold standard. Anything less, and the murmurs begin. Miss by an inch? The crowd gasps. Take a second swing. They groan. A third. Now they're booing. Some are laughing. One kid just started crying. Someone throws an onion. And let's be honest, you feel it too. The shame, the failure, the victim still twitching on the block, the blood spurting wrong, your boots sticky with regret. You weren't trained for this part, the psychological shrapnel that comes from turning someone's last moment into a civic embarrassment. Sometimes the axe gets caught in bone. Sometimes the condemned jerks at the last second. Sometimes your hand just slips. And in those moments, your entire reputation and possibly your job hangs in the balance. Because here's the thing, no one cares how hard the job is, they just want it to look easy. Executioners are supposed to be clinical, unemotional, precise. If you falter, you risk looking weak. And in a world obsessed with strength, weakness is contagious. And the rumors spread fast. He needed 2 swings. His hand was shaking. The guy suffered. You become a cautionary tale whispered in red lines. Don't end up like that, poor soul. Or worse, like the guy who couldn't even finish the job. So you go home, scrub your blade, and relive every mistake, every gasp, every groan. You replay it until your mind is too tired to keep spinning. And even then, it lingers. Because in your world, the axe doesn't just fall on the condemned. It hovers over you too, every time you step onto that platform. So you've done the deed. The crowd has gasped, gawked, and dispersed. The condemned is headless. Justice is served, and the village square is back to selling cabbage. Time to pack up and head home, right? Not even close. Being an executioner wasn't just about swinging an axe. That was the dramatic part, the flashy moment. The rest, far messier, far quieter, and far more grotesquely underappreciated because someone has to deal with the body. And surprise, it's you. You might be asked to burn the body, bury it in unconsecrated ground, or stuff it into a shallow grave under the gallows, the medieval equivalent of a garbage chute. No funeral, no ceremony, just the faint hope that the local dogs don't dig it up. And you don't get gloves or soap or a break. You are effectively the sanitation department of death, the final cleaner of sin, the silent janitor of justice, and no one thanks you. In fact, the same people who cheered the execution now avoid you even harder because you smell like ash and entrails. There are also the side jobs. Torture, that's on you. Branding criminals, you again. Public shaming setups. You're the guy with the hammer and nails. Sometimes they'll even have you flog someone while reading scripture aloud, multitasking your way through a moral meltdown. Oh, and if a noble demands discretion, guess who's cleaning up the noble's mess with 0 witnesses and a very real understanding that if anyone talks, they're next. Executioner by title. Yes, but by function. Your medieval society's all-purpose horror technician. When the crowds disappear, the priests go silent, and the court scribes head back to their parchment. You stay behind. You finish the job no one else can stomach. For all the fear, revulsion, and existential dread wrapped around your role, being an executioner does come with one undeniable perk. You get paid. In fact, you're often paid more than your average peasant. Sometimes much more. Executions, torture sessions, dismemberment duties, they all come with a tidy purse of silver. Add in bribes for extra discretion or making it quick. And you might even find yourself with the kind of money that makes bakers envious. But here's the catch. You can't spend it like a normal person. You walk into a tavern with a jingling pouch and suddenly the room gets real quiet. The barkeep pours your ale, then wipes the counter like your presence is a stain. You tip him double. He still won't look you in the eye. You go to buy a new tunic, and the tailor hands you the finished product with tongs. The coins you give him are real, but to him they're cursed. Blood money, he mutters, as if the silver will bite him. And heaven forbid you try to give charity. One time you tried donating to the church. They took the donation, then used it to pay someone else to clean the holy relics just in case. Sure, you can accumulate wealth. You might even build a small home with actual furniture. Rare for your class. But the irony, the more you earn, the more isolated you become. You're rich, yes, but rich like a dragon hoarding gold in a cave, alone and feared. People assume the money makes up for the stigma, that a heavy purse balances a heavy conscience. But gold doesn't silence nightmares. It doesn't scrub the blood from your memory, or buy you back your humanity. It just sits there cold, shiny, useless for the things that matter. You don't buy peace with money in the Middle Ages. You buy silence. You buy space. You buy the right to drink alone at a corner table without being told to leave. And deep down, you know the truth. every coin you carry was bought with someone else's last breath. That's the currency of your life, and no amount of it ever buys forgiveness. In a town of maybe a few hundred people, everyone knows who you are. They know your name, your house, your footsteps, your job, and most importantly, your shadow. They whisper it. That's him. They murmur it as you pass. Executioner. They pull their children close as if you might accidentally decapitate someone mid-walk. And yet, despite this widespread recognition, no one really knows you. You could have a favorite song, a childhood memory, a surprisingly decent hand at wood carving. But that doesn't matter. Your entire identity is reduced to one role, the blade. People don't see you. They see what you do. You're a living job description. Even when you're off duty, just walking to buy onions, people cross the street like you're contagious. No one asks how you're doing. No one asks if the job weighs on you because they've already decided you don't feel anything. You're not human to them. You're a function, a necessary evil, a walking reminder that justice requires someone willing to get their hands dirty, and they're grateful it's not them. The isolation becomes your defining characteristic, not your skill with the axe, not your knowledge of anatomy, not even your strange ability to read people's last thoughts in their eyes. Just the fact that you exist apart from everyone else. You're the only person in town who truly understands what it means to be alone. Even hermits have visitors. Even lepers have each other. You have shadows, silence, and the weight of carrying a job that everyone needs but no one wants to acknowledge. And the strangest part? You start to prefer it. The isolation becomes a shield. If no one gets close, no one can see how the job has changed you. How your hands shake when you think no one's looking. How you sometimes forget people's names, but remember exactly how they screamed. How you've developed a 1,000-yard stare that goes right through normal human interaction because you've seen things that make regular conversation feel like children's games. The loneliness is both your punishment and your protection. It keeps you sane by keeping you separate. Because if you ever let anyone truly close, they'd see what you've become. And that sight might be worse than the executions themselves. Your expertise doesn't end with the swift stroke of an axe. Medieval justice was creative in its cruelty, and as the town's official death dealer, you became a master of multiple methods. Hanging, drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, flaying, and a dozen other techniques that made simple beheading look merciful. Each method required different skills, different tools, and different levels of psychological preparation. Hanging was supposed to be straightforward. Tie a noose, drop the criminal, watch them dangle. But there's an art to it. Too short a drop and they strangle slowly, kicking and gasping while the crowd grows restless. Too long, and you risk decapitation, which defeats the purpose entirely. The perfect hanging breaks the neck quickly, a sharp snap that ends consciousness before pain can register. It sounds technical because it is. You're not just executing someone. You're performing precision engineering with human bodies. Drawing and quartering, reserved for the most serious crimes like treason, was medieval justice at its most theatrical. The condemned would be dragged behind horses through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. Finally, they'd be chopped into quarters, with the pieces displayed publicly as warnings to others. Your job was to manage the timing so the victim remained conscious for as long as possible without actually dying until the final cut. It's grotesque, yes, but it served a purpose beyond simple punishment. These elaborate executions were lessons in power, demonstrations of what happened when you crossed the wrong people. Your role was to deliver that lesson with maximum impact. The more horrible the execution, the more effective the deterrent. Or so the theory went. Burning at the stake, usually reserved for heretics and witches, required different expertise entirely. Green wood burned slowly, extending suffering. Dry wood burned quickly, potentially killing from smoke inhalation before the flames could do their work. Your job was to build the fire that would burn hot enough to kill, but slow enough to allow the condemned time to recant their heresies, hopefully saving their souls even as their bodies were destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on you. You were supposedly saving people's eternal souls by torturing their temporal bodies. The Church insisted that physical suffering in this life was preferable to eternal damnation in the next. You weren't murdering heretics. You were offering them a last chance at salvation. Whether that theological reasoning helped you sleep at night was another question entirely. Each method of execution came with its own crowd. Hangings drew families with children, treating the event like a public festival. Beheadings attracted nobility who appreciated the swift efficiency of the procedure. Burnings brought religious fanatics who cheered every scream as evidence of purification. And the truly elaborate executions, the drawings and quarterings, drew bloodthirsty spectators who came for the spectacle rather than the justice. Managing these different crowds became part of your expertise. You learned to read the mood of an audience, to time your actions for maximum impact, to play to the crowd's expectations while maintaining control of the proceedings. When things went well, you were invisible, a professional functionary carrying out society's will. When things went wrong, you became the focus of anger and disappointment from people who had come expecting entertainment. The psychological toll of mastering multiple execution methods was cumulative. Each technique left its own mark on your psyche. The quiet efficiency of beheading was almost peaceful compared to the prolonged agony of burning. The theatrical cruelty of drawing and quartering made simple hanging seem merciful. But all of them involved ending human life, and that weight accumulated regardless of the method. You developed preferences, though you'd never admit them publicly. Some methods were cleaner, quicker, more humane. Others were deliberately cruel, designed to maximize suffering as part of the punishment. Your personal inclinations toward mercy or sadism influenced how you approached each execution, though professional requirements often overrode personal preference. The tools of your trade reflected this diversity of methods. Your workshop contained axes of different weights and blade angles, ropes of various thicknesses and materials, specialized knives for disembowelment, and the equipment needed to build scaffolds and stakes. Maintaining this arsenal required constant attention and occasional innovation, as new methods were developed or old ones refined. You became an expert in human anatomy, not through medical training, but through practical experience. You knew which cuts would cause immediate death and which would extend suffering. You understood how bodies responded to different stresses, how long someone could remain conscious during dismemberment, what level of blood loss was immediately fatal versus gradually debilitating. This expertise made you valuable to more than just the justice system. Sometimes physicians consulted you about injuries and their likely outcomes. Sometimes torturers sought your advice on extracting confessions without accidentally killing their subjects. Sometimes even priests asked quiet questions about the nature of death and dying. information they couldn't get from theological texts. Your knowledge was both practical and theoretical, based on direct observation of human death in all its forms. You understood mortality in ways that doctors, priests, and philosophers could only theorize about. Death wasn't abstract to you. It was your profession, your expertise, your daily reality. That knowledge was both valuable and isolating, setting you apart from people who could afford to think of death as a distant possibility rather than an immediate practical concern. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected your work in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Winter executions were less common, partly because travel was difficult, and partly because crowds were reluctant to gather in cold weather. But winter also meant that bodies decomposed more slowly, creating disposal challenges that didn't exist in warmer months. Spring brought renewed activity as traveling judges made their circuits and winter's accumulated cases were processed. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. As nature renewed itself, human justice cleared its accounts, ending lives as new life began blooming. You performed more executions in spring than any other season, matching the natural cycle of death and rebirth with the artificial cycle of crime and punishment. Summer executions were the most challenging physically. Heat made the job more demanding, blood coagulated differently, and the smell of death lingered longer in warm air. But summer crowds were also larger and more enthusiastic, providing the energy that made executions feel more like entertainment than solemn legal proceedings. Autumn brought a melancholy quality to your work that matched the season's themes of endings and transitions. Leaves fell as lives ended, both part of natural cycles that put individual deaths in cosmic perspective. The symbolism was too obvious to ignore, and it affected both your own psychology and the crowd's responses to executions. These seasonal patterns created anticipation and dread in equal measure. You knew that spring would bring busy months of frequent executions. Summer would test your physical endurance. Autumn would challenge your emotional resilience. Winter would provide respite, but also time for reflection that wasn't always welcome. The weather on execution days could make or break the proceedings. Rain turned scaffolds slippery and crowds irritable. Snow made everything more difficult and dangerous. Wind could affect hangings in ways that turned routine procedures into spectacles of incompetence. Sun was best for crowd management, but could create problems with blood coagulation and body disposal. You became expert at working in all conditions, adapting your techniques to compensate for weather-related challenges. You learned to tie knots that held firm in rain, to maintain footing on icy scaffolds, to time executions to avoid the worst heat of summer days. These practical skills were as important as your knowledge of anatomy and crowd psychology. The seasonal nature of your work also affected your income and social interactions. Busy execution seasons meant more money, but also more stress and isolation. Quiet winters provided financial pressure, but also opportunities for reflection and recovery that weren't available during active periods. Your relationship with the condemned varied depending on the crime, the individual, and your own psychological state at the time. Some criminals were genuinely dangerous people whose deaths made society safer. Others were desperate individuals whose crimes reflected more about social conditions than personal evil. A few were clearly innocent, victims of political manipulation or judicial corruption. These different categories of condemned prisoners required different approaches. Dangerous criminals needed careful handling to prevent escape attempts or violence. Desperate criminals often evoked sympathy that made your job emotionally harder. Innocent prisoners created moral crises that challenged your ability to function professionally. The last conversations with condemned prisoners were among the most intense human interactions you experienced. Facing imminent death, people revealed their true characters in ways that normal social situations never permitted. Some maintained dignity and composure that commanded respect. Others broke down completely, requiring emotional management that went beyond your official duties. Last words became part of your personal collection of human experiences. Some final statements were profound expressions of faith, regret, or acceptance. Others were mundane concerns about family or property. A few were curses directed at you, the justice system, or society in general. All of them represented the final expressions of individual human consciousness, and you were often the only witness. Your role in these final moments was complex and contradictory. You were the agent of their death, but also sometimes their only source of human comfort in their final minutes. Some prisoners sought absolution from you, as if your forgiveness could somehow balance the scales of their execution. Others tried to maintain their dignity by refusing any interaction with their killer. The prayers and religious rituals surrounding executions created theological complications that affected your own spiritual life. You participated in ceremonies that asked God's blessing on acts of killing, prayers that sought divine approval for ending lives that God had created. The logical contradictions were obvious, but the emotional and spiritual implications were more complex. Some condemned prisoners found genuine peace through final religious observances, achieving a state of grace that made their deaths seem almost voluntary. Others went through the motions of confession and prayer without apparent conviction, seeking any possible advantage rather than spiritual comfort. The variety in human responses to mortality provided insights into faith, fear, and human nature that no theological education could offer. Your own religious beliefs evolved through exposure to hundreds of final prayers, confessions, and spiritual struggles. You saw people die with absolute faith, complete despair, and everything in between. These experiences shaped your understanding of divine justice, human responsibility, and the nature of salvation in ways that formal religious instruction never could. The question of whether you were serving God or defying Him remained perpetually unresolved. Legal execution was sanctioned by authorities who claimed divine mandate, but the act itself involved ending lives that religious doctrine held sacred. This theological puzzle had no clear answer, leaving you to navigate your spiritual life with minimal guidance and maximum uncertainty. Your expertise in death made you an unofficial consultant on questions of mortality, suffering, and human endurance. People who would normally shun your company sometimes approached you with questions they couldn't ask anyone else. How long does it take to die from various injuries? What does it feel like to be hanged? Do people really see their lives flash before their eyes in their final moments? These consultations were usually conducted in secrecy, whispered conversations in dark corners where no one could observe the questioner seeking knowledge from someone universally shunned. Your answers were based on direct observation rather than theoretical knowledge, making them more valuable and more disturbing than information available from other sources. Sometimes physicians consulted you about the nature of death and dying, seeking practical knowledge that their formal education hadn't provided. Sometimes priests asked questions about the moment of death that they needed to understand for their own spiritual counseling. Sometimes ordinary people who had witnessed accidents or violence sought reassurance about what their loved ones had experienced. Your role as an unofficial expert on mortality was both burden and opportunity. It provided occasional moments of human connection based on your professional knowledge rather than social status. But it also reinforced your isolation by emphasizing the morbid nature of your expertise. You were useful for understanding death, but that usefulness came at the cost of normal human relationships. The knowledge you possessed about human death was comprehensive, but grim. You understood the physical process of dying in detail that few others could match. You knew how consciousness faded, how bodies responded to fatal injuries, how long various forms of death actually took. This knowledge was scientifically valuable, but emotionally devastating. Your observations of death and dying contributed to a broader understanding of human mortality that extended beyond your immediate professional requirements. You became an expert in pain, suffering, and the limits of human endurance. That expertise informed not just your execution techniques, but also your understanding of life, consciousness, and the nature of human existence. The political dimensions of your work became more apparent as you gained experience and observed patterns in who was executed and why. Justice wasn't blind. It had preferences, prejudices, and political motivations that affected who lived and who died. Your role as the instrument of these decisions made you complicit in whatever injustices characterized the system you served. High-profile executions were often political theater designed to send messages about power, authority, and the consequences of opposition. The choice of execution method, the timing of the event, and the amount of ceremony involved all reflected political calculations that had little to do with the actual crime or the criminal's guilt. Your participation in these political spectacles made you a player in larger games of power and influence, even though you remained invisible as an individual. The effectiveness of political executions depended partly on your professional competence. A botched execution could undermine the political message, while a perfectly executed death could enhance the demonstration of authority. The condemned in political cases were often more dangerous than common criminals, surrounded by supporters who might attempt rescue or seek revenge. Security concerns required coordination with guards and officials to ensure proceedings concluded safely. These high-stakes events tested your professional skills under maximum pressure, while highlighting the political nature of your work. But political executions also carried greater moral complexity. Common criminals had usually committed clear violations of law and social order. Political prisoners might be guilty only of opposing authority or holding unpopular opinions. These